Okay, we are now moving on to quiz 13. So let's just do a quick review here of the rules. Kind of rolling off the screen here. Alright, let's do a quick review of the rules. I've summarized the qualitative rules down here. So it actually got kind of wordy, so I just used abbreviations. So the rule number 5 says if the two premises are negative, the conclusion is invalid. In other words, you can't make a valid conclusion if you have two negative premises. On the other hand, if I have two positive premises, I can make and I must make a positive conclusion. Negative, they refer to as affirmative. So if my two premises are affirmative, my conclusion must be affirmative. Then rule number 7 says if either one of my premises are negative, either one of them are negative, it doesn't matter, first one or second one, either of them are negative, my conclusion must also be negative. So let's flip to the first syllogism on quiz 13. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. All right, first thing, identify major and minor terms. Major, minor, middle. So, major term, that means this is the major premise. Minor term, this is the minor premise. Now let's talk about distributed or undistributed. Whenever you see all, that makes it pretty clear it is distributed. And that means therefore, by the way. Okay. All men are mortal. If this is a subset of all mortal things, and it says all men are in there, am I referring to everything in the set of mortal things? No, because out here I have cats. Cats are mortal things and they are not men. So this is undistributed. Let's come down to the next one. Socrates is a man. Am I referring to all the things that are Socrates, have ever been Socrates, or ever will? Well, I'm referring to one particular Socrates, and so it's only one, but it's all of that one. Therefore, yes, this one is distributed. Let's come down here. Therefore, Socrates, once again, same argument as above, that one is also distributed. So let's talk about these two. Man, is it distributed or undistributed? If this is the set of all men, I'm saying Socrates is just one. I shouldn't draw it as a circle. He was just one. So that dot is Socrates. So obviously I'm not referring to everything that's ever been a man or ever will be a man, because Socrates was only one. Therefore, this is undistributed. I'm not referring to every man in this full set. Last one I have to identify is this word right here, mortal. In the conclusion, is it distributed or undistributed? If this is a set of all mortal things, Socrates is just one in there, not everyone in there, so obviously mortal here is undistributed. Alright, so let's go see. We've identified everything and we've said whether or not it's distributed or undistributed. Now let's go see if it meets all of the rules. Actually, you should remember the first couple. Let's see if we can do it from memory. Rule number 1 says there must be 3 and only 3 terms. I have 1, 2, and 3. So yes, it obeys rule 1. Rule 2 says the middle term must not occur in the conclusion, and it does not. So I'm okay there. Rule number 3 says, I forgot. Let's go back and check. Rule number 3 says, oh yeah, if it's distributed in the conclusion, must be distributed in the premise. Alright, I have Socrates distributed in the conclusion. Is it distributed in the premise? Yep, so that's good. Is this distributed? Nope, so I don't have to examine it any further. So we're okay with rule 3. Rule 4, middle term must be distributed at least once. Yeah, no, yes, so I'm good with Rule 4. Okay, Rule 5. Now I have to look at whether my whether my premises are affirmative or negative. So let's go look at that for a second. Is it affirmative or is it negative? All men are mortal. I'm affirming something positive, or I'm positively affirming this to be true. So that's a positive statement. And here, this is also, I'm affirming something to be true. Socrates is a man. That's an affirmative. For this to be non-negative or not affirmative, it'd be if I'd said Socrates is not a man, or all men are not mortal. Those would be negative statements. But these are positive. I'm saying that this is true. Socrates does equal a man. And down this one here, am I saying that this is affirmative or negative? Socrates is mortal. I'm affirming that these two are equal, so it's positive. So I have two positives and a positive. So rule number 5 doesn't apply. Rule number 6, positive and positive, that's the case we have. The conclusion must be positive, and indeed it is. 7 doesn't apply because I don't have a negative premise. So actually, this first syllogism is valid because it obeys all 7 of the rules. So our first one is valid. Let's move on to the second one. Okay, let's talk about this one. This is the second premise on quiz 13. We know where to start, right? Major. So this is the major premise because that's my major term. Minor. So that's my minor premise because that's my minor term. And middle term. Okay, let's go ahead and determine whether they are distributed or undistributed. No hawks. Well, I have to look at every hawk that has ever existed in order to be able to say no about it. So this must be distributed. It must be indeed referring to every hawk in the set. I had to look at every single one to be able to say no hawk. Some birds. Well, if it's only some of them, then it's obviously not all of them. So I'm obviously not talking about every bird in the full set. So it must be undistributed. Same thing down here. Some birds, therefore undistributed. All right, let's look at the conclusion. No hawks are warblers. This is my set of warblers, and this is my set of hawks. None of them overlap, but I have to look at every single one of these warblers in here to be able to say it's not a hawk. So obviously it must be distributed. I have to indeed examine every one in here to make that statement. Now, what about the second statement? Some birds are hawks. Here's my hawks. Some birds are hawks. But not every bird is a hawk, only some of them. So this is undistributed. And the last one, warblers. That's warblers. And this is birds. Some birds are warblers, not referring to everyone in the full set. So again, this is undistributed. As long as we're here, before we start looking at the rules, let's go ahead and look at whether our premises and our conclusion are affirmative or negative. No hawks. So I'm basically saying a negative thing. None of them are. So this is a negative statement. Some are hawks. Some are. I'm saying a positive thing about only some of them, but it is a positive thing. Birds do equal hawks. Some of them anyway. So that's a positive, an affirming statement. And what about the conclusion? Some are. Again, I am saying positively that some birds are the same as warblers. So that is a positive or an affirming statement. All right, so we've examined the terms, the quantitative and qualitative attributes. Now let's see how we're fitting on all our rules. We should be able to, let's try them by memory. see if my memory's good. 3 and only 3 terms. 1, 2, and 3. No equivocation tricks there. So rule number 1, we're good. Rule number 2, the middle term must not occur in the conclusion. It does not. So rule number 2, we are good. What does rule number 3 say? Rule number 3 says distributed in the conclusion must be in the premise. Do I have anything distributed in the conclusion? I don't. So I actually don't have to worry about rule 3. It doesn't apply. Rule 4, middle term must be distributed at least once. Middle term but it's distributed, so I'm good. Rule 4 is good. Rule 5, 6 and 7. It's getting kind of hard to see here. So I have these cases. So what case do I have here? My premises, I have 1 negative and 1 positive. So I'm good on rule 5 and 6. They don't apply. What about rule 7? Rule 7 says if either one of them is negative, my conclusion must also be negative. We know we have this situation. Is our conclusion negative? Oops, it is not. So this syllogism is invalid because it violates rule 7. Okay. So this is the next syllogism on quiz 13. I went ahead and identified major and minor terms. Again, be careful here. Glorious is not a noun. It is a predicate adjective in this sentence, so the implied noun here is things. So your major term is glorious things. Make sure that you're careful about this on the final, because if you're not getting this correct, it will be wrong. Glorious is not the major term. Glorious things together is the major term. Defeat is your minor term, and victories is your middle term. So the one thing we haven't done yet is gone through and determined whether they were distributed or undistributed. Anytime we say all, we know we're talking about everyone in the set, so we know it's distributed. We can go ahead and put that there. No defeat. Anytime we see no, we know we have to examine every single defeat in the full set of defeats to be able to say no defeat. So again, anytime you see no or all, it is fully distributed. No defeat down here, so this one's also distributed. Now let's look at our conclusions, our glorious things. So if this is my set of everything that is a glorious thing, and all victories are in here, am I referring to every glorious thing? No, because I have other glorious things that are not victories, such as chocolate, which is a very glorious thing. So this must be undistributed. What about victory? No defeat is a victory. So if this is victory and out here is defeat, it doesn't overlap at all. But I have to look at everything in this set of victory to make sure that it doesn't relate. And by the way, I have to look at every one in here and every one in there to make sure that no single item in here equates to any single item in here. So this must be distributed. And let's do this last one. If this is the set of all things that are glorious, and no defeat is in there, so once again I have over here defeat, but once again I must look at every single glorious thing and every single defeat to see if any one item in here equates to any one item over here. So it must be distributed. Okay, so I have labeled everything as distributed or undistributed. Now let's look at the premises and the conclusion and say whether or not they're affirming or negative. All victories are glorious things. I'm affirming that this does indeed equal that. That is affirming, so it is a positive statement. No defeat is a victory. I'm saying this does not equal that, so it's a negative statement. No defeat is equal to that, so once again this is a negative statement. Okay. So we've done all of our descriptions, we have all of our attributes. Now let's go see how we do in our rules. Let's start with rule number 1, 3 and only 3 terms. We have 1 term, 2 terms, and 3 terms, and no equivocation tricks, so we're good. Rule number 2, middle term must not occur in the conclusion. Check, we're good there. Rule number 3, if it's distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premise. So do I have anything distributed in the conclusion? Both distributed, 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 undistributed. I pointed that actually violates Rule 3. So this syllogism is invalid because we violate Rule 3. This term is distributed in the conclusion but not in the premise. Okay, let's look at this one. Major term is the predicate of our conclusion, and that would be swimmers. So this is the major term. Okay, now be careful, because notice up here it's not the same. It's not swimmers. Can swim. Actually, my sentence is not, this premise isn't written in the correct format. You remember I'm supposed to have a form of be here. So really what this premise should be rewritten to imply should be all mermaids are swimmers. So that's the correct format for the premise. It's implied here. Forgot a period there. Okay, so my major term here is swimmers. Don't put swim. Some of you put swim. Swim is a verb, not a noun. So my major term is swimmers. That makes this first premise my major premise. All right, what is my minor term? My minor term, pretty easy. Nymphs. Middle term, mermaids. No equivocation going on anything there. So let's go through and talk about whether they are distributed or undistributed. All mermaids, that's distributed. Some nymphs, it's got to be undistributed. Some nymphs, got to be undistributed. All right, let's look down here at these. Swim, swimmers. These are all swimmers. Things that swim. That's what T is. Things that swim. Swimmers. Okay? All mermaids are swimmers. So this is the set of all mermaids. Am I referring to everything out here that swims? No, because I can actually have out here a fish. A fish swims, and a fish is not the same as a mermaid. So in this case up here, this is undistributed. Mermaids. Some nymphs are mermaids. So here's my set of mermaids. Here's my set of nymphs. Some of them overlap, but not every one. So therefore, mermaids here is undistributed. And then I come down here, swimmers. Again, here's my set of swimmers. Some nymphs are not. So here's nymphs. Oops. Oh, that would still be that way. But this is what I'm looking for. Some nymphs are not swimmers. But in order to be able to answer this, I have to look at every single swimmer in this set of swimmers to make sure that it does or doesn't overlap over there, right? I have to look at every single one in here to make sure it's not a nymph. So this is actually distributed here because I must examine every single one to be able to make this statement. All right, so we have everything labeled as distributed or undistributed. The last thing to do is to talk about whether they are, the premises are affirmative or negative, and likewise for the conclusion. So all mermaids can swim. Am I making a positive statement of something equals something? Yes, I am. So this premise is positive. Likewise here, I'm making a positive statement about something is equal to something else. So it's also a positive affirming statement. Down here, some are not. Well, I'm actually making a negative statement here because I'm saying something is not equal to something else. I probably don't need to go any further. You probably already know that I'm going to violate one of the rules. But this particular syllogism is a little bit tricky, it got some of you guys, because we still need to go through all of them. So let's go through all of them. Rule number 1 says there can be 3 and only 3 terms. I have 1, 2, and 3. Rule number 1, check. Rule number 2, the middle term cannot occur in the conclusion. It does not, so rule number 2 is okay. What does rule number 3 say? If it's distributed in the conclusion, must be distributed in the premises. Undistributed, so it doesn't apply. Distributed, so I have to look at it. Distributed in the conclusion. I'm going to make sure I point the right one this time. Undistributed in the conclusion. So it looks like I violate Rule 3. But don't stop there, guys, because something can be invalid for multiple reasons. And some of you were tricked by this because the first rule violation you found, you stopped looking. They weren't asking you just, was it valid or invalid? They were also asking you, if valid or if invalid, what rules does it violate? So you really need to go through all of them. So let's keep going. Rule number 4. The middle term must be distributed at least once. Middle term undistributed, distributed. Check. Rule 4 is good. Alright, now we're down to 5, 6, and 7. So we have to know what combination of circumstances do we have down here. We have 2 positives and a negative. Oops. According to the qualitative rule, if my 2 premises are positive, I must have a positive conclusion. So I'm actually violating rule, what? Rule 7. Sorry, 6. So this syllogism is invalid because it violates Rule 3 and violates Rule 6. Okay, that is the end of quiz 13. Okay guys, one last thing. I was planning on making a sample test, but I decided after making these videos, instead of doing that, I'm just going to walk you through the book and highlight for you the things that I highly suggest, hint, 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 highly suggest that you study and know. I'm not going to allow you to use note cards on the test. I didn't actually say I would, but the point here is I want you to make note cards and be able to study. So I'm going to actually walk you through and tell you the exact categories of things that will be on the test, so you can make note cards of these and be memorizing them. So here you go. Take good notes. First thing you will see on the test, you need to be able to describe the 3 mental acts and the 3 verbal expressions that go along with those. The second thing you need to be able to do is to define what quantity means. Give the definition of the word quantity and the definition of the word quality. Properties, I guess I should call them. You need to be able to give the definition of those. Next thing, you need to be able to identify the AE, I, and O type statements. You need to be able to say whether they are affirmative or negative, universal or particular, and you need to be able to give an example. All SSP is a kind of A, no SSP is a kind of E, and so on. So you need to be able to basically understand quantity and quality of the 4 categorical statements and be able to actually say what the 4 categories of statements are. Next thing, you need to be able basically to reproduce this chart to identify the relationships between the 4 categorical statements, whether they're contradictory, subaltern, so on and so on. Next thing you need to know, you need to be able to do these diagrams. So study chapter 8. If they give you a statement such as all men are animals, that they give here on this page 57, you need to be able to diagram it. So study chapter 8 and make sure that you're able to diagram. There's a few examples there that you'll need to be able to do. Next thing, you need to be able to, and once you diagram, the diagramming is basically what helps you to be able to label them as distributed or undistributed. So you need to be able to label A, I, E, and O statements as whether they are distributed or undistributed in the subject and or the predicate. And if you follow kind of the way I did it in the quiz, I mean, you could memorize these, but I think it's easier to just understand what distributed and undistributed means. I find that it's easier to diagram it, and then from the diagram I know, rather than just trying to memorize its a statement so it's distributed in the subject. Understand it and you can apply it better than just memorizing those. Next thing you would need to understand, you need to give me the steps for how to avert a statement. You need to give me the steps for how to convert a statement and how to contrapose a statement. You need to be able to identify, define the three terms in a syllogism, and identify and define major and minor premise in a syllogism. And you need to have these 7 rules, be able to write them out in correct numerical identification. I don't care if they're in the right order, but you need to identify them correctly. So if you get some of these mixed around, that would still be partially incorrect. So that's what you need to know for the test. I highly recommend you make flashcards on those and study them. And we will see you next Monday.